Welcome. Thanks for being here. My name is Molly Straukler, and I'm the Events and Volunteer Manager at Shenandoah National Park Trust, the official philanthropic partner of Shenandoah National Park. Our mission is to enhance, protect, and preserve Shenandoah's natural and cultural resources. The Trust funds a wide variety of projects and programs in Shenandoah, from trail and overlook maintenance to invasive plant and insect management to historic preservation and so much more. The Trust also funds a large portion of Shenandoah National Park's educational programming, which provides a broad range of recreational, educational, and service learning experiences in Shenandoah National Park for youth and young adults. Our Play, Learn, Serve Fund supports in-park field trips, summer youth camps, and virtual learning programs, along with professional development opportunities for educators and young people who may not otherwise have a chance to visit the park. Tonight, we are lucky enough to have one of Shenandoah's wonderful interpretive park rangers with us. I am thrilled to welcome Ranger Karl Rand. Karl has worked as an interpretive ranger with Shenandoah National Park for nearly 5 years, spending most of his career there at Big Meadows. Now, as a visitor center supervisor, Karl takes his greatest joys from sharing his passion for this national landscape, its varied history, and beautiful wilderness with the public and his team alike. Now, I'm going to throw it over to Karl. Thanks for being here, Karl.
Thank you so much. And it's a pleasure being here sharing the stories of Shenandoah National Park, especially given that 2026 is our 90th anniversary of Shenandoah. So it's a very exciting year as we look back through chapters of history and wilderness and natural scenic beauty that makes this national park so special. But tonight we're just focusing on one of those chapters of our early park history, and that, of course, is going to be the boys that built the Blue Ridge. This is the story of the Civilian Conservation Corps within Shenandoah. When I first came to Shenandoah in 2021, I wasn't really much of a history guy. My background is in wildlife biology, so talking about animals comes very naturally to me. And as I started giving these different programs of our human history related to the national park, I started to really fall in love with all of the storied past and certainly storied future of this beautiful landscape. And one of my favorite programs that I give during our summer season in person up at Big Meadows is a walk through a former Civilian Conservation Corps camp. Now, virtually, and especially with all the snow still kind of laying out on the mountain, it's hard for us to walk through that former CCC camp, but I'd love to guide you through a day in the life of a CCC boy, and particularly their impact that they had on Shenandoah, and the impact that Shenandoah had on them as well. Now, if any of you have been up to Big Meadows area to the visitor center, I'm sure you've stopped maybe even to take a photo next to this kindly gentleman. This statue is known as the Spirit of the Civilian Conservation Corps, or as we nickname throughout the United States, Iron Mike. Now, Iron Mike isn't just found up in front of the visitor center at Big Meadows, but you can see almost 80 individual CCC Iron Mike statues throughout the United States. And all of these statues are going to be in significant areas to recognize the efforts of the CCC. Some more prominent places, and some of you in the audience might have encountered Iron Mike in your travels in places like Red Rock Amphitheater in Denver, Colorado, Zion National Park in Utah, and Cuyahoga Valley National Park up in Ohio. But again, there's far more than just those, and you see him dotting the landscape throughout national parks, state parks, and other public lands, all areas where the Civilian Conservation Corps was active. But of course, what we're talking about tonight is what exactly was the CCC, why the CCC was active and so popular during its time frame, but most importantly, the legacy that we, as lovers of our public lands, as visitors to places like Shenandoah National Park, the legacy that we still get to experience and be inspired by that was impacted by the Civilian Conservation Corps. Now, some of you in the audience are probably pretty familiar with what the CCC was, and of course, it all boils down to it was in response to the Great Depression. In the late 1920s, 1929, we had a stock market crash. which plunged us into the single greatest economic downturn of the century, the Great Depression, which would last for several years thereafter. Now, during this time, of course, a lot of people looking for work, a lot of people dropping out of school, a lot of people just trying to fight to survive and feed themselves and their families. And we were also in the middle of kind of a presidential change. So, who we're looking at here is Herbert Hoover. And this president was actually really formidable in the formation of Shenandoah. He loved the mountain landscape so much that he actually created his summer presidential retreat, Rapidan Camp, in Shenandoah National Park, and it still stands to this day, where we lead summer tours down to his former stomping grounds. Now, to briefly talk about Hoover, before his presidency, he was a household name. He was everybody's favored candidate for the 1928 elections because of his previous experience in humanitarian aid during World War I and other work as the Secretary of Commerce and other duties working in politics. He was such a shoo-in for the 1928 election that he actually won in a record-setting landslide of Electoral College votes, 444 votes in favor of Hoover. Unfortunately for him, that glory would last very briefly because in October 29th of 1929, the stock market crashed, again, plunging us into the Depression. Now, for all of the accolades that Hoover had up until then, people did not like how hands-off he was in response to the Great Depression. But again, he had, and the nation had never seen anything quite to the severity of economic recessions or depressions up until then. So a lot of Americans felt that he abandoned the people during this very difficult time. So while he won in a record-setting landslide of 444 votes in 1928, just a few short years later, in 1932, he lost in a new record-setting landslide of votes, 472 electoral votes in favor of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. One of the big things that made FDR a prime candidate for the 1932 election was his direct response to the Great Depression. And a lot of this was lined out in his New Deal. And much of the New Deal was focused on getting people back into the workspace, particularly in a lot of public works entities. We had responses like the WPA and, of course, what we're talking about today with the CCC. And all of this was focused solely on getting people back to work. For the Civilian Conservation Corps, which we're focusing on for the rest of the evening, that was primarily focused on getting young men back into the workforce. Now, so much so that there were certain restrictions or things you had to be to qualify to serve in the Civilian Conservation Corps. Namely, you had to be within the age initially of 18 to 25 years old. So you'll find throughout the rest of the program, I'll be referring to these service members as the boys of the CCC, as they were lovingly nicknamed. Now, this program became so popular that that age limit of 18 to 25 was actually expanded from 17 to 28 years of age. They also had to be healthy. It was going to be, as you'll see later on, a lot of strapping, grueling, hard work out in public landscapes. And they also had to be unmarried and have no other family duties, taking care of younger siblings or grandparents. They had to be relatively untethered because they were going to be moving all throughout the country. And we'll see just how great the CCC footprint spread throughout this program as it gained popularity. And then the purpose of this workforce to be able to get these young men, these boys, through and accommodate thousands, as we'll see, that finally served throughout the 9-year period from 1933 to 1942. They would initially serve a 6-month term, either the summer-fall term or the winter-spring term, which we'll talk more about, and they could serve as many as 2 years worth of service. But after that, they were out into the workforce. Of course, this was doing, again, hard manual labor, but it wasn't for nothing. to one of the great benefits of the CCC, of course, was earning a paycheck and learning skill sets. These young men, for their hard work, would actually earn $30 a month, but only a few of that was seen in their own pocket. So only $5 of those dollars ended up in their own pocket, and the other $25 was directly mailed back home. It was mailed in a check and was generally specifically addressed to the mother of the household if there was one, because it was said at the time there was concern if it was addressed to the father, it would be drank by the time the next paycheck came in due to the hard times that everybody was on. So these young men, these boys actually didn't see too much of a salary, but one of the great aspects of the CCC that eventually made it such a mainstay success was that it was employing these young men, but it was also benefiting their home communities. Now, here in Shenandoah National Park, we certainly had a lot of local young men coming up from Page County, from Harrisonburg City, from Charlottesville, but even more often we had people coming from out of state, even people coming from large urban areas, New York City, Chicago, Boston, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., and they're being sent out to them probably an alien landscape, serving in the wilderness in these national parks and public lands, and their paycheck is benefiting their home communities. And that really was one of the most genius aspects of the CCC that made it a success. And of course, there were a lot more benefits, as we'll soon see, that directly impacted those boys as well. So here in Shenandoah, because this was kind of a newfangled idea, FDR's New Deal and especially these work programs were not really seen to this magnitude up until then. So the president wanted to keep some of those earlier camps a little closer to home. As a matter of fact, the very first Civilian Conservation Corps camp, called NF1, stands for National Forest 1, otherwise known as Camp Roosevelt, as we see in the photo, actually opened its doors in May of 1933, just across Shenandoah Valley from the national park over in the Washington and Jefferson National Forest. And again, that still stands to this day. The buildings no longer stand, but the footprint of that campus does. Now, just a few short days later, seeing this new first camp open its doors, they opened camps 2 and 3, and both of those opened their doors in Shenandoah National Park. So not only were we the very first national park with CCC presence, but we were some of the very, very first camps. And that kind of set us up as a guinea pig project as part of this whole Civilian Conservation Corps program. Now, while these camps no longer stand, as a matter of fact, many of the buildings were purposefully removed due to the entrance into World War II. A lot of those constructs, the barracks, the mess halls, and other offices were repurposed for the war effort. So none of those buildings that were in use in these camps still stand within the national park. You can still walk around much of the footprint of those campuses. In total, throughout the 9-year run of the Civilian Conservation Corps from 1933 to 1942, there was roughly 12 camps. We say 10 to 12 camps. At any given time, there were 12 operating camps, but in total, there were 12 distinctly different camps. At Big Meadows, we still have laid out the footprint of Camp MP2, National Park 2, otherwise known as Camp Fetchner, as you see here in the photo as well. Now, in these photos, I love this. It always makes me wonder how they got these photos back in the 1930s and 40s. But this gray photo on top is actually an overhead view of that Camp Fetchner at Big Meadows. You can see, if you've ever been to the meadow, it was much, much larger back then. And Skyline Drive cut a little bit closer to where the meadow stands now. At the bottom is a photo of Camp NP1, the very first camp to open within a national park, otherwise known as Camp Dern, and that was actually up in the Skyland area. Now, at each of these camps, there were 200 boys stationed, and again, if you can imagine, 9 to 10 different locations, 200 boys at each for a span of 9 years. constant activity of these young men, of these boys working hard over the landscape, doing a variety of hard labor projects. Here we see some of the equipment that, of course, they would be using. Many of the trucks. Skyline Drive was just started underway in the late 1920s as well, so they were using some of the first of Skyline Drive that was built. And they were, while the CCC was not doing any of the construction or paving of Skyline Drive, they were doing a lot of the kind of satellite projects alongside it. So the lower project there with all of the logs laid out, that's them constructing erosion control to help build up banks and hillsides along Skyline Drive. Of course, they're removing a lot of trees and brush and stone along Skyline Drive to clear the way. And they laid miles and miles worth of telephone cable as well. So 136 miles of telephone line, thousands of acres of scenic vista that we still get to enjoy today, over 4,000 signs, and even some of our sewer systems. Now, some of their works that we still get to see and experience to this day, one of our most iconic is our headquarters building down just east of the town of Luray along US Highway 211. This beautiful stone structure, all of the carpentry, the masonry, obviously the electronics and plumbing have been updated, but that was largely laid by hand by the boys of the CCC, and we still get to see and experience and enjoy that structure to this day. A lot of our maintenance buildings throughout the park as well were originally constructed by the CCC and still stand to this day, the works of their own hands. And one of my favorite, at least to talk about, one of my favorite remnants of their projects is, if you look at this photo, of course, you have the excavator, you have the truck, and then you have all of these stones off to the right. That is actually them laying the low rock wall that we find along Skyline Drive at many of the overlooks and other passes. Those were all originally put in by CCC, and a large majority of those still remain as the original CCC rock wall. Now, by the summer of 1933, again, this is the inaugural year of the CCC, over 250,000 men enrolled across the country. By the end of the 9-year stint, it was in excess of 3 million men had served in the CCC. It had gotten so popular, a couple summers ago, I was giving this walking tour in the summer, and I love giving the CCC program because there's usually somebody in the audience who has a family tie to the CCC, an uncle, a grandfather, a neighbor who had served. And this woman shared, she was a local, she was from the town of Stanley, and she said her father served in the CCC. And I figured, okay, you're local. Where in Shenandoah did he serve? And she said, well, he didn't serve in Shenandoah. This was in 1939. They didn't need him in Shenandoah. They sent him off to New Mexico. So this just goes to show how the chess pieces of these boys were truly being sent out all across the nation, and as you can see, even into Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, to complete these projects, and there wasn't always a need for them near home. But that gained a lot of experience for those boys, and again, spread that economy even further during those difficult times of the Depression. By the end of the 9 years at Shenandoah, over 6,500 had served here specifically in the national park. Now, if you were on your first day to Shenandoah, you're selected, you're going for your first 6-month term, of course, you would wait in line to get your traveling trunk, your uniforms, and you can see here they're all waiting in line getting their feet measured for their boots. But your very first stop in camp would be to the administrative tent. And if you have ever visited the campus at Big Meadows, the very first layout, we have a little interpretive sign talking about the administrative cabin or building where the officers managed, and that's where you would go day to day to get your work orders. Again, that's where you would check in on day one, check out on your last day as well. Now, the interesting thing about these camps is even though they were truly civilian camp areas, they were run very much so like a military operation. The boys would wake at 6 a.m. sharp to the bugle call reveille. They would go out to meet at the raising of the flag. Then it was back to the barracks to get ready for the day before hitting the mess hall. At the end of the day, they would meet again after dinner for a lowering of the flag before sunset. And then by 9:30, it was lights out to get ready for the next workday. Now, these were kind of questioned early on. FDR was actually, you know, asked why he decided to have these camps run by Army officers. So the gentleman that would actually be conducting the work projects each and every day, overseeing the operations, even though the projects came down from the National Park Superintendent, who was running the camp was actually officers with the United States Army. And there was quite a few questions because at this time, again, early 1930s, later on in getting into the late 30s, we were already seeing some questionable things overseas, to say the least. Of course, we were seeing youth work camps, very similar seeming to Americans over in Germany. And these work camps being run, of course, then by the Nazi Party made some people question our own president's motives at the time. But Franklin Roosevelt was able to defend his decision in that during this time we had already been in the Depression for several years, going on 4 years. These boys were being sent from all over. They had been down on their luck. Many of them dropped out of school. Many of them lost their jobs. Many of them maybe even taken to crime. And now they're being sent away from their home communities, away from their family to learn new skills and do heavy work. As Franklin Roosevelt defended his decision, these boys needed a regimented lifestyle to complete these projects. And only the Army at the time could really provide that regimented structure for these young men. And of course, it ended up being a great success by the end of it. Now, some of those other great benefits, if I was a young man, age 17, say, probably my favorite place in campus would be the mess hall. They, of course, were fed 3 squares a day, sometimes field meals if they were out doing construction projects. But the mess hall was the largest building on campus. And it was said within the first month and a half of these boys being stationed at a CCC camp, they would put on an average of 18 pounds of weight. Not only are they, of course, doing heavy work, so building muscle, but they're being fed very, very good rations, high in protein, high in fat. I always like to share this, of course, a Christmas Day menu. You can get a glimpse of how well these boys were being fed, of course. Always a lot of meat, always a lot of carbs, and you'll notice they never skip on dessert. They would even have pudding following breakfast. One thing that just kind of shows the change in times, you notice down at the bottom, along with dessert, they also offered cigarettes, cigars, and coffee and Christmas favors. So it's always interesting looking through these old menus and seeing just how well these boys ate. But you can imagine being in the Great Depression, having to share your food amongst your siblings, and now you're out eating military rations and eating very well for the time. Again, many, many more great benefits. One thing I always like to mention as well in regards to the mess hall is there were a lot of benefits for the surrounding community as well. There was a stipulation within the CCC, within the New Deal, that aside from the boys that were working, the CCC enrollees, those 200 in camp, there were a lot of other duties to be completed. The cooks in the mess hall, the nurses in the medical station, the teachers in the schoolhouse, which we'll get to in a few more minutes. And most of those roles were being completed by locals, by people coming up from the valley, or even mountain residents at the time in the early 1930s. But additionally, there was an agreement that a certain amount of the produce supplied in the mess hall, a certain amount of the protein, of the meat that was supplied, of the grain that was supplied, had to be locally sourced from farmers as well. So again, not only is this a great boon to the boys being put to work and their economies back home with those checks that are being sent back to their families, but it was a great boon to the local communities around these camps. So much so that over time, a lot of areas were asking to have CCC camps erected in their nearby public lands because of the other additional benefits that would be granted by those living and working around those areas. Now, early on, as they were initially setting up these camps, they were very basic. Again, based off of military training camps. You see here, these were largely heavy-sided canvases on low raised wooden platforms. But I mentioned at the very beginning, you would either serve the summer season or the winter season. So those heavy canvas tents did not last long. These are photos following a blizzard in the Big Meadows area in the mid 1930s. The gentleman in the bottom photo is standing alongside a 12-foot perimeter fence. That was not to keep out the deer or bear. That was solely to keep out the wind and snow drifts because before they could start their work for the day, they had to go out and shovel and remove snow and ice from the work area as well. So I'll let you decide which season you would rather serve in the CCC. Now, each of these camps, to accommodate the 200 boys that were stationed there, would have anywhere from 4 to 6 barracks, kind of long building structures, communally inhabited, as you can see here, all of those cots lined up in one open area. You notice the boys' uniforms pressed and hanging along the outside walls, and you'll also notice the pot-bellied stoves, the wood-burning stoves throughout the middle. While each barracks would house anywhere from 35 to 45 individuals, usually there was one or two of those young men who had the additional duty of keeping those fires fed throughout the night. And usually for what I would consider to be the most important job in campus, they would always earn a little bit extra money, as the other boys of their barracks would pitch in $1 here and $1 there to make sure they woke up to a nice, warm, cozy barracks. Additionally, there was a lot of other hubbub and goings on happening at the time here at Shenandoah. As I mentioned again, this is the celebration of our 90th anniversary. We technically became a national park December of 1935, but really the big to-do happened on July 3rd, 1936. And the photo I'm sharing here is an image of that day taken out in the middle of Big Meadows. And that's when Franklin Delano Roosevelt himself came out to give a commemoration speech, specifically addressing this new national park, Eastern National Park in Western tradition, as they said, a large wilderness mountain landscape within a mile of the cities, as they stated. Now, at this point, the boys of the CCC had already been working in the area since May of 1933. You can actually see down towards the bottom section of that photo, a long line, a single file line of young men walking away from the presidential speech. Those are all CCC members that were stationed in the camp just up on the hill where you see some of those hoisted white tents there over in the background. Now, what was incredible is that FDR gave that speech to commemorate the national park, but then afterwards, he went and had lunch at the nearby Camp Fechner. You see the president there in the center being served by one of the boys there in white who had been cooking in the mess hall for the president himself. Now, in his speech, of course, even though he was addressing the nation in commemoration of this new national park, I feel much of his words were also directly aimed at the boys stationed not too far away. And in part of his speech, if anybody in the audience has ever been to Bird Visitor Center at Big Meadows, I'm sure you've heard this speech on loop. I hear it 100 times a day in FDR's own words, where he states, "I now take great pleasure in dedicating Shenandoah National Park, in dedicating it to this and to continued generations of Americans for the recreation and for the recreation which we find here." Recreation and recreation is how he ended that speech. Now, I'm an interpretive ranger, so I always want people to think about, mull over in your mind what you think the president was referring to when he said recreation and recreation. creation. FDR was a notable orator, so typically he always had multiple meanings to his speeches. And on one hand, I certainly like to think that he was referring to the recreation of a landscape, the recreation of a mountain by creating this new national park. I feel like he was addressing the individuals in the audience that day, recreating yourself as you come out and feel rejuvenated, refreshed in the mountain air, getting out on hiking trails and experiencing the natural wonders of your nation, the recreation we feel when we do that. But I also think he was directly referring to the young men nearby that were actively recreating our economy during these very, very difficult times in the 1930s with the Great Depression. Now, of course, it was these young men, these boys, that were doing the recreating of the park recreation by installing over 100 miles of hiking trails, over 160 miles of horse trail. Many of these trail systems still in use to this day. And of course, as you can see, over 1,100 miles worth of fire hazard trail. So they were doing firefighting as well as, again, the heavy labor of putting in these trail systems. Additionally, as I said, FDR was probably referring to recreating the landscape because Shenandoah National Park had been in use for hundreds of years. We know based on land records that the earliest European habitation of the mountain and use of the land stretches back to the 1740s. People were cattle grazing, timbering, particularly of the chestnut tree at the time. They were mining for copper. So much of the landscape as we see to this day in Shenandoah looks vastly different from how it did back in the 1930s when the CCC started their projects. As a matter of fact, I tend to describe Shenandoah National Park as a little bit like Disney World. When Skyline Drive was first being constructed, the National Park Service actually hired on landscape architects specifically to draw up blueprints every step of the 105-mile long Skyline Drive to say this tree goes here, these flowers go there. It was a landscape designed by people and built for people to draw visitors out to this beautiful natural landscape. But all of that Disneyfying, I should say, of the mountain landscape wasn't going to happen overnight. And it was largely the boys of the CCC that were doing the planting. They planted thousands, hundreds of thousands of trees, shrubs, seeds by sapling or by full transplant, as you see right there. Much of the forest that we see to this day of a roughly 200,000 acre national park was planted directly by the CCC or are the secondary growth from those original plantings. So a lot of how we experience Shenandoah, that recreation and recreation, is directly thanks to their efforts. But of course, it wasn't just all work and no play. One of the other great benefits of serving with the CCC is while they did do a 5.5 work week, so they worked Monday through half of Saturday, then they had the rest of the weekend off. And with this, they could benefit from learning, from gaining an education. Again, at this time, many of these young men that were serving had dropped out of school or perhaps had never been in school to begin with. At the time, the average education for young men was up to the 8th grade, and many did not reach beyond that. However, 2 buildings on each campus of these CCC camps benefited their education. The first and foremost was known as the technical building, and that's where they learned all of the direct trade related knowledge that they needed to complete the projects at hand. So this was everything from automotive mechanics to electrical and plumbing work, masonry and construction, carpentry, absolutely. Many of them came in with none of that experience. And now, as they leave after their 6 months, or even if they continue for 2 years in the CCC, are they going to lose that skill set? No, They're going to take that knowledge with them. They're going to take all of their trade that they've learned at the CCC and be bettered for the workforce going forward. Some of them actually took these trade skill sets towards the end of the CCC stretch in 1942. The reason why it wrapped up after that 9-year stretch was because that's when the United States started to enter World War II. As a matter of fact, in those later months, many CCC boys actually were served draft notices while serving at these campuses. But of course, you have a healthy population of able-bodied men that know the skills, they know the trades, and more so, they're proud of the skills and trades that they've learned. They're proud of the works of their own hands. They're proud of the works and efforts that their nation has done and what it's provided to them. So many of them, even if they weren't drafted into World War II, many of them signed up willingly after serving in the CCC, and they took those skills with them. Now, along with that technical building, there was also a schoolhouse at each campus. And they would specifically bring in school teachers. Everything from elementary through college courses was taught. And you can see just a short list of some of the things that were taught there. But even beyond that, one of my favorites, so civil behavior listed down there at the bottom, looking into some of our former documents on what exactly these classes were, civil behavior essentially taught people how to prepare themselves for society, how to dress and present themselves for job interviews, things like manners, how to dress properly, how to care for yourself, and just a lot of things that young men at the time, especially with the hardships of the Great Depression, would benefit greatly from. Now, it was not mandatory that these young men took school courses. It was completely by choice. But we do have many documents, and I wish I would have grabbed one for this program tonight. But one in particular is dated back to 1938 at specifically Camp Fetchner, which is the Big Meadows camp. And it shows of the 200 boys that were serving that summer season, all but like 16 of them, the majority of them had enrolled in courses. And of that, there was a number, there were fewer than 20 that were taking college courses. The majority of them were taking elementary courses, and 2 of the entire, 180 that were enrolled in the courses, 2 of them were completely illiterate before joining the CCC. And now not only are they earning this job, but they're learning how to read, learning how to write, learning basic arithmetic. So, are there greater benefits than just a paycheck for those who served in the CCC? But of course, they were allowed to have fun as well. And that takes me to the last building I'm going to talk about today, and probably the most popular on campus, and that was the rec hall. Each camp had a rec hall. You can see one of the interior photos of the Big Meadows rec hall here. They had pool tables. They had a not quite half-court basketball court. They had ping pong table. They also had a traveling library of over 1,000 different books and magazines and other publications. Within the rec hall, they would also have weekly teachings or courses led by the camp nurses, all about personal hygiene and basic first aid. Additionally, they would show movies on Monday nights provided by the Departments of Interior and Agriculture, usually based on the sciences and jobs related to that. Additionally, they would go on weekly trips down into town. They weren't just sequestered to the mountain, but on Saturdays and Sundays, they were allowed to go down to see movies, to dance halls, to ice cream parlors down in the towns of Luray, Harrisonburg, Elkton, and Front Royal. And yes, as you can see here, they also had sports teams. So each camp had basketball teams, had baseball teams, had boxing, had even swimming competitions that they would do down in the valley on their weekend trips. As a matter of fact, one of the most popular baseball fields, so many of the camps had baseball fields, but at Big Meadows, there used to be a baseball field right there at the edge of camp. And a lot of this was actually built up with clay that had been dug out at the base of Dark Hollow Falls area near a former mine. Now, interestingly, the all of the teams at Camp Fetchner and Big Meadows were actually named the Camp Fetchner Indians. And that's largely related to the fact that it was said for those who served in the Big Meadows area, you could not drive a spade into soil without overturning arrowheads. Remnants, again, of even the earliest people that were using this mountain for the betterment of their communities. This next slide that I kind of jumped to earlier there, I love this. Many of those boys actually met their sweethearts while serving in the CCC, either on those weekend trips down to town or at dances that would actually be hosted monthly at camps like Camp Fetchner. This couple in particular, Russell Barlow and Louise Painter, they were married up on the mountain, and I love the photo to the side there. Rather than walking under handfuls of thrown rice, they walked underneath an arbor of work shovels. Louise Painter was a local from Stanley. She is actually one of 3 sisters who all married CCC boys when they were here for their seasons. Now, those sweethearts might have met again at those camp dances, which were hosted, which were usually publicized in the camp newspaper. They actually had a working printing press up at Camp Fetchner, and the name of their newspaper was called the Camp Fetchner Powwow. Again, a direct tie to the fact that they found a lot of artifacts and remnants of the earlier native populations and indigenous communities that used this landscape long before them. Now, I always like to end my program on a couple of quotes to kind of tie into the legacy that made this program so important. The first of which comes from Franklin Roosevelt himself in his proposal to Congress, where he said, "I propose to create a civilian conservation corps to be used in simple work. More important, however, than the material gain is the physical and spiritual value of such work." And this next quote is directly from one of those boys that had previously served. And he stated, "One fact is certain. No boy left their time in the Blue Ridge Mountains unchanged and without having, in some way, changed the mountains." Because these young men, these boys, would come, serve for 6 months, maybe serve for another few terms, up to 2 years. Then they were back to their home communities. They took their knowledge, they took their skill set, they took their education, they took their experience from Shenandoah and these other Civilian Conservation Corps camp areas back for the betterment of themselves, the betterment of their family, and the betterment of their communities. Many of them continued work in the trades that they learned at these camp areas. Some of them went off to serve in the war. Some of them didn't come home. Some of them met their sweetheart. Many of them settled down in the surrounding area, settled down in Shenandoah Valley, even if they weren't local, because they found love during their time with the CCC. But one thing that's certain, and again, as I mentioned earlier, I love hearing people's family stories or personal stories related to this program because there are so many of them. But one thing that is certain in all of those shared stories is that these boys eventually became old men. And these old men would return year after year after year to commemorate themselves, to celebrate the works of their hands. This is a photo taken in 2007 at one of the many return alumni celebrations of the former CCC boys. But what they celebrated most was the experience that they took with them, the legacy that they had that impacted the mountain, the place where they worked and loved, but the legacy that continued with them, that they gave back to their families, gave back to their communities, and gave back to themselves. I thank you so much for your time in following me with this program. But again, I always like to end on the fact that while this is just one story of the nation, this is just one story of Shenandoah as a national park. This program, while it was deemed a huge success, had a lot of personal semblance and personal importance to the boys that served throughout that period. If anybody has questions, Molly, if there's any questions,
Yeah.
I'd love to answer some of those.
Absolutely, Carl. Thank you so much. Who knew a webinar could be so engaging? You're great. All right. We have a couple questions that were pre-submitted.
Nice.
One is, what were the main tools that were used?
So, of course, for the time, a lot of it was going to be just simple hand tools, pickaxes, shovels, McLeods. If you do any landscaping or if you're a wildland firefighter, all of those same tools that we use to this day. But along with that, you saw in some of those photos, they did have heavy equipment. They did have, of course, those big military style trucks and excavators that they could use. And one of my favorite things, we'll show a CCC video up at our auditoriums in the visitor centers, and they have footage of them dynamite blasting old trees. And that was one of the most effective ways that they would clear way for new trail or just get rid of all of the dead trees that have been standing.
Who knew? That doesn't seem super safe. All right. Interesting. You kind of mentioned earlier that a lot of people have family members or know a neighbor or grandparent who served. If you had family who served, how can you access those records, or where's that information available?
Great. So, and this is a question I get asked a lot. For Shenandoah, we do hold a lot of those records in personal archives. And certainly, if you know you have a family member or know somebody who served specifically at Shenandoah, you can reach out to the park and we can coordinate with our archivist to draw up some of those older records, and especially oral histories. We have a lot of those interviews and stories. But for those that I get the question of my grandfather served, I'm not sure when, but I know roughly when. I'm going to screen share again with a website.
Oh, I gotta get you.
Million
Not yet.
me's. There we go. So the National Archives.
Is that up? No, almost. There we go.
Can you see that? All right. So the National Archives, based out of St. Louis, that actually holds all CCC enrollee records. You can actually email or call in or mail in. There is a nominal fee for copies if you want physical copies of the records. But if you have any of the information about the person you're looking for, they can print out and send you back those records for your own, family, keep in the safe to be able to share stories of your loved ones who had served.
Oh, very cool. Thanks for sharing that, Carl.
Of course.
Another question. What did the boys wear?
Yes. So, this one, admittedly, I submitted this question because I always like talking about this. And we have a couple replicas of their uniforms. They don't fit me, so I never wear them. But they had a few different uniforms. As you can imagine, being run by the military, they had their work uniforms, which was largely going to be heavy denim jumpsuits. And even if you were in the Virginia summer term, you would still be wearing that heavy denim jumpsuit. That's why you probably notice a lot of shirtless CCC workers in those photos, because the denim didn't last long. And my personal favorite, the big denim floppy hat. But along with that, no CCC camp would be complete without their dress uniform as well. So again, when they would go to these dances that they hosted, or even for meeting at the flagpole, oftentimes they would have those khaki service dress. And again, very military in style, but they always made sure to have them pressed, have them look nice, because you never know when the president might stop in.
Oh, very true, especially this close to DC. We've gotten some questions in the chat. Um,
Absolutely.
One is, was the CCC open to men of color?
That's a really good question. And another one that I get a lot. So, as you can imagine, the 1930s, 1940s, these camps were largely segregated. And I found in looking into it, a lot of the camps were even segregated uh, amongst the white workers based on where they were from. So, like, there would be the Baltimore camp, there would be the Pittsburgh camp, there would be the Philadelphia camp, because they kind of figured that would prevent potential conflict. Um, but there were CCC camps for African Americans. In the Southwest, there were CCC camps for Mexican Americans. Unfortunately, not every state had camps for minority populations.
Mm.
Interestingly, I was looking through my notes again earlier today, and I found um, in Shenandoah, in Virginia, there were over 80 different camps throughout the entire state. And of that, there were about half a dozen. So, roughly, I don't remember if it was five or six that were specifically African American. So, unfortunately, just a fraction of the population. But yes, it was segregated, but it was open to it. Another thing, and not to talk too long, but
No.
I always like to mention one question I get a lot is if women could serve. So the Civilian Conservation Corps was largely men only, but the nurses, the cooks in the mess hall, the teachers especially were female, but they weren't technically CCC members. However, there was a separate group, kind of a separate project that went on for just part of the time. So, thanks to our First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, love that woman, very tenacious. She insisted that the president do a female version of the CCC, do a women's response work program as well. And it was later nicknamed the She. But that only served for 4 years. It was from 1934 to 1933 to 1937. Pardon me. But what's interesting about the female Civilian Conservation Corps is while it didn't serve as long, they were still doing much of the same work that the men's camps were. They were also earning an education, a free education, but it had one of the largest responses by Native American communities. A lot of Native American women served in the female Civilian Conservation Corps effort, which I find fascinating because, of course,
Yeah.
important to all communities in those days, but especially the Native American community in that day.
Oh, who knew? Very cool. Thanks, Carl, for sharing. Have time for maybe one or two more questions. One, I'm gonna pick this one because I think it sounds interesting. So it says, so you talked about the landscape architecture, like there was a plan, right? And you had to follow that plan. So did they take in consideration native plants versus invasive, or maybe not invasive, but non-indigenous plants at the time?
You know, we've learned a lot about conservation since since even the Civilian Conservation Corps. Um, yes and no. So one of the photos that showed them planting a lot of shrubbery, that was all mountain laurel, which is native. That was one of the heaviest things they planted, which is why we have so darn much mountain laurel on the mountain. But that was specifically chosen because it was good for erosion control, as well as being a pretty plant. However, since again, kind of the Disneyfying back in those days, trying to attract more visitors to Skyline Drive, there were a lot of species that were not native to the area that were selected because of their beauty. Some of them you might be familiar with Tree of Heaven, which is a beautiful flowering plant. We are now battling with it because of the spotted lanternfly, but that was one of the species that was planted for its both its beauty and the fact that it spreads quickly, so that way we could reforest the area pretty quickly. So they did take into consideration native species, but again, we learned our
Yeah.
lesson here and there.
Yeah, definitely. That's yeah, I'm not surprised. Not
Yep.
surprised. Um, Let's see. I mean, that's kind of the bulk of it. I know there are some questions in the chat that have gone unanswered, and I'd be happy to maybe email them to you at a later
Sure.
date. And if anybody feels that Karl didn't address anything that you guys want to know more about, email me. I'm Molly. I send you guys a lot of emails, so just reply back to that, and I'll get those questions to Karl. Karl, anything else you want to say to end? Feel
No, just that again. There's a lot of obviously beauty on the mountain. You folks all joined this webinar because clearly you're passionate about Shenandoah, and in this our 90th anniversary, it's no better time than to start looking into all of the different stories that make this landscape so special.
Absolutely, yeah. Shenandoah's 90th, very exciting. Thank you, Karl, for being
Yeah.
here with us and sharing your time and expertise. It's always good to see you. And thanks to everybody else who spent their evening with us. Have a wonderful evening, and we'll be in touch. Have a great one.